every day, every night. You see the Russian meat grinding assaults where the Russian men just run across the fields or into the city and try to take the position, and then the Ukrainian drones are dropping bombs, bottles of liquid flammables on the Russians. But the Russians are getting smarter, so instead of charging in groups of 20, they'll charge in maybe groups of 4 or 6, and they'll spread out. So even if an FPV drone tries to hit them, it doesn't take them all out. And they also move on bicycles, on motorcycles, on quads, so that it's not as they're more maneuverable, and so you rarely see a heavy armor uh, or like a BMP driving near the front. But then with enough Russian soldiers that gather into a building, it can take them a week, it can take them 2, and majority of them will die.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by David Kirichenko, the Ukrainian-American freelance journalist and associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. David, welcome to Frontline.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
I wanted to start by asking for your response to what seems to be a growing narrative in some quarters at the moment, that given the incremental advances Russia is making on the front line in the east of Ukraine, and given the ongoing delays to fresh military aid for Ukraine by the West, that somehow Ukraine, it's over for Ukraine. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think Russia has been able to set the war up in a favorable position for itself by setting it up to be a war of attrition. And so Russia has no issue expending as much humans as possible to take land. And so the Ukrainians right now are trading space in order to inflict as much casualties on the Russians as possible and to make it more costly. But it is true is that in a war of attrition, it is not going to favor Ukraine. And so Ukraine, feeling boxed in, looked for creative solutions. And so we saw the Kursk invasion. And so, of course, that's going to be debated for a long time, whether or not that was effective and what its aims were to achieve. But Ukraine fighting with its hands tied, when the Russians dropped dozens of glide bombs on Ukrainian positions, they obliterate entire villages and towns, and so there's no place for Ukrainian defenders to dig in and to fight back, and so they're going to keep retreating under the pressure of these relentless Russian assaults unless something changes, unless the Ukrainians can get long-range strike capabilities to strike these weapon depots, headquarters, the airfields that Russia is using to bomb Ukraine. And so Ukraine is trying to change the narrative. And we did see for the first time after the Kursk invasion that the majority of Americans believed, according to a YouGov poll, that Ukraine was actually winning the war. And so Ukraine is trying to change that narrative and show that we do have the ability to go on the offensive and to fight back. And so if the West continues on its current trajectory of just letting Ukraine grind it out in a war of attrition, yes, it's not going to be favorable for Ukraine, but that's why Ukraine is pushing, building its own long-range drones and trying to build its domestic weapons industry to sustain itself in a long war against Russia.
It's a really interesting point about the perception of the winnability of this war for Ukraine, because, I think, speaking to a lot of analysts, there is a sense that, yes, absolutely, if we were able to fully supply Ukraine to the extent that they need to be supplied with, fresh military aid, it is a winnable war. And we've seen, for example, through the Kursk incursion and the success that Ukraine had at taking that territory and then holding most of it. And we've seen, for example, as you mentioned, with some of the long-range drone strikes that Ukraine has been able to do on infrastructure and energy supplies inside Russia, they have been incredibly effective, which makes you think if only they had further military aid, then they would be in a far stronger position and not just avoiding defeat, which seems to be where they are at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think back in February when Ukraine started hitting those Russian oil refineries, the Washington Post was reporting that the Biden administration was furious at the Ukrainians and telling them to back down, and Ukraine did the opposite. They continue to double down on that strategy, and then later in the year, there were supposedly peace talks to happen in Qatar, to not bomb one another's energy grids. And so what that showed is that Russia understands strength, Russia understands power, and when inflicted with enormous damage, it will bring the Russians to the table. And so just even looking at that scenario is the more weapons and crossing of these supposed Russian red lines, the more that it's actually likely to bring Russia to a table, and the more that we cower and we back away, the more that Putin and the Russian elite will believe that they just need to continue the war of attrition and grind the Ukrainians out, and they'll take all of Ukraine. And so I think I believe his name was John Sullivan, but he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, both under the Biden and Trump administration. And reading his article or interview in the Foreign Policy magazine, he spoke about how the Russians negotiate. They have extreme paranoia. They shoot for the moon, and they always have maximalist demands, and they don't budge at all. And so the Russians, feeling that they have the upper hand, will just go for everything. And we saw that Putin, to even kick off negotiations, he said that at a minimum he wants to keep all the land that Russia occupies now, and just to even start the demand. So if you think what a final settlement outcome for Russia could look like with maximalist demands, I mean, ultimately they want Ukraine to capitulate, and they're not going to waver from that.
And I wonder, David, to what extent you think there is significant damage already being done to Russian oil depots and other energy supplies inside Russian territory. I mean, we mentioned those drone strikes that Ukraine have been launching. How severely is that affecting Russia at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think in the initial months, the Russians had to put an oil embargo on, and they, sorry, excuse me, they had to put an oil embargo on, and definitely the Russia was not able to export as much, and I think there were signs that it was painful. I think as time went on, I think the effects became not as strong as it was initially, but the Russians still continue to feel it. I think it's hard to get clear data, but the fact that the Russians wanted to negotiate and come to Qatar with the Ukrainians to try to put a pause on the Ukrainian drone strikes meant that it definitely was painful, and the Russians were feeling it.
I wanted to get your thoughts on your recent visit to Ukraine. You've just returned from the country. What were your key takeaways, both in terms of how the war is playing out there, but also in terms of the morale of Ukrainian troops and the Ukrainian people?
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to go around, be around the battle for Donetsk, Chasiv Yar, so key strongholds in Donetsk Oblast, not far from Bakhmut. I was also in Kharkiv Oblast, near the Russian border. Then was in Zaporizhia on the southern front. But I think overarchingly, I mean, one of the first takeaways is that these Ukrainian positions, the soldiers would often tell me that they suffered 15 to 30 glide bomb attacks throughout the night. And so when they're trying to defend against the glide bomb, the artillery, the drones, it's just unimaginable how Ukraine, with so little, not only in this period, but throughout the whole war, has fought back. And for myself, being on the front and just seeing the magnitude of the war, and when the Ukrainian soldiers are pulling, it's not that the Ukrainian government is incompetent or not doing something right, but the scale of this war is just so massive. It's the biggest war in Europe since World War II. And so you see Ukrainian drone units needing to pool their money together to buy supplies for themselves. And they have families, they have wives, they have children, and they need to make a decision of, do I buy a jammer for my vehicle to protect against enemy drones, or being bread provider, do I send money back to my family? And so Ukraine, with so little resources, has not only like brought the fight back to Russia, but has beaten them on several occasions. And so you just think, what if Ukraine did have all the resources that they needed to win? What if they weren't fighting with their hands tied and they were properly equipped? Then the Ukrainians would, I think, very quickly be able to I think, reach a battlefield settlement against Russia. And I mean, every Ukrainian commander was like, we're only being given enough to win. Sorry, to defend ourselves and just to hold our lines at a maximum. We can't go on the offensive. We don't have the resources. And if I think back to my time with a motor battery unit in Kharkiv, um, I think this is like something very, very nuanced but very interesting. Is that they told me what they struggle with a lot is, of course, not having enough like shells to shoot. That's given. Some days they can get 70, some days they can get 20, some days they can get none, and shipments typically come twice a week. But even when they do come, they'll get um, so many variations of those shells. So they'll get Romanian, they'll get Italian, Ukrainian, American, Pakistani, Indian, and all those shells fire a bit differently. And so if they just get a small batch of shells, and they're new shells they haven't worked with yet, and they start firing them, the trajectory's off, and by the time they correct and get everything working, they're out of shells. So they actually have a messaging app where they talk with artillery units across the Ukrainian army, where they offer best practices on how to fire specific shells, since they always vary and they don't shoot the same type of shells, and it's a big struggle for those Ukrainian units. But also, even when they go to the front line and they look for dugouts of where they can fix the position, the Ukrainian the unit commander, and so the officers have to go themselves and scout. And in my time that I was there was a one officer that was stepped on a mine and was killed, and they don't know if it was like a Ukrainian mine. It could have been a Russian enemy mine dropped from a drone. That's becoming increasingly common, where drones just fly and drop mines. Um, and then in Chasiv Yar, I spent time with a drone unit, and essentially what I saw and what the commanders were telling me is that the only reason they're holding the entire front line there in Chasiv Yar is because of these drones. And so every day, every night, you see the Russian meat grinding assaults, where the Russian men just run across the fields or into the city and try to take the position. And then the Ukrainian drones are dropping bombs, bottles of liquid flammables on the Russians. But the Russians are getting smarter. So instead of charging in groups of 20, they'll charge in maybe groups of 4 or 6. And they'll spread out. So even if an FPV drone tries to hit them, it doesn't take them all out. And they also move on bicycles, on motorcycles, on quads, so that it's not as they're more maneuverable. And so you rarely see a heavy armor uh, or like a BMP driving near the front. But then with enough Russian soldiers that gather into a building, it can take them a week, it can take them 2, and majority of them will die. But once enough Russian soldiers reach say a bunker or a basement of a building, they get in and they just start digging and dig and dig and dig so that Ukrainian bombs can't hit them. And say after a week, 10, 20 Russian soldiers finally make it into those dugouts of that basement, then the Russians will drop glide bombs, shoot artillery, their fighter jets. They'll drop everything on the Ukrainian positions nearby. Then the Russian infantry that gathered in that position will run over into the next building or to the next street. And so very gradually, the Russians are able to take street by street, building by building, after they just destroyed everything. And Ukraine, they're not able to take out these fighter jets or the planes that are dropping these glide bombs. And so until something changes, losing its most motivated men to defend these lines when it doesn't need to be that way. And I think the most painful lesson of this was in Avdiivka earlier this year when the U.S. was withholding aid. So, and that's when the Russians really began to turn up the notch with using glide bombs. And so the soldiers told me when they were stationed in Avdiivka, um, it was dozens and dozens of glide bombs throughout the day, throughout the night, and they held their ground, but they sacrificed. They were losing their best men for it when it didn't need to be that way. And so to compensate for the lack of artillery in a lot of parts of the front line, they use drones. But drones are very effective in the sense that they're accurate, they can hit the position, but still, in Avdiivka especially, the jamming, the electronic warfare was so intense that drones were very limited in the area at times. And so, in a sense, drones are very effective. They change aspects of warfare, but you just can't change the raw firepower and its effects on the battlefield. And I definitely saw, like I was with soldiers training to storm trenches, and you can see the new conscripts and the soldiers that have been there for a few years, and the level of motivation between them. But I think that, well, follow the news for years and just see, I think, both the turmoil abroad and how the West supports Ukraine and the withholding of aid. And so, if you think about it, like how many people would be motivated to go fight a war where they know that not only will you fight with your hands tied, but aid might not be coming in, you might not get all the weapons that you need. And I think even Zelensky himself said is that he wanted to equip 4 brigades in the last like 6 months with Western military aid, and he doesn't even have enough to equip, I believe, one or two. And so a lot of Western aid is promised that doesn't actually come. And I've definitely been with units that told me about when they used Western gear, whether it was older tanks, the manuals would be in different languages, the parts would be broken. And then when you think about combined arms warfare, taking older equipment from different countries, trying to combine everything together and get it to work in harmony, or even just repairing some of these weapon systems can take a long time, bringing it out of the country. And so Ukraine is just stringing so much together. And to me, when I was out there on the battlefield with the drone unit, and you're just standing out there, to me, like when I see analysts or some commentator on TV, like look at these battle maps and talk about it, then when you're standing out there in the front line, it just feels like there's such a disconnect, and the battlefield is so chaotic. There's just drones hovering above you constantly, both enemy and friendly drones. All you hear is drones around you, and the night sky lights up from bombs being dropped. You just hear like tanks nearby driving, um, uh, and artillery both in and out, and it's just such a chaotic and hellish environment that yeah, it's astonishing to me that Ukraine has fought this well and for this long with so little resources. And like the Ukrainian soldiers tell me, if we had more weapons,
Mm.
we'd be able to do a lot more on the battlefield.
I mean, David, that's genuinely fascinating hearing your account of those conversations you were having on the front line and your experience of visiting Ukraine. I mean, there's so much to pick up on there. I suppose what you said about the shells is a really good point, because for all the media focus on what you might call the bigger, sexier weapons like the Storm Shadows and the Scalps and the F-16s, it does come down to raw firepower. And I mean, this is a lesson as old as time, really. I mean, you go back to the shell crisis of 1915 during World War One. You need artillery, and it's like we haven't learned that lesson.
Right. I mean, tanks. I mean, yeah. I mean, first, raw firepower. I mean, its importance it has not changed on the battlefield. Artillery is very important, and the Ukrainians for much of the war, I think at the peak when the U.S. aid was withheld, the Russians were firing 15 or 10-1, and at times I think 15-1. A couple of months ago, Zelensky said it was about 12-1. But both with some more military aid flowing in and Ukrainian drone strikes, long-range drone strikes on Russian weapon depots, they've actually, from what I've been able to read, bring it down to about a 1 to 3 ratio. And so the Ukrainian drone strikes, I think even uh, last month near Moscow, where it registered a mini earthquake. And so these long range drone attacks that are hitting these weapon depots are actually restricting Russia's ability to bring firepower, like this large firepower onto the battlefield. And so this, say, like the Storm Shadow missiles actually do have a role to play in determining whether or not Russia can bring that raw firepower to the battlefield by hitting those weapon depots. And then tanks as well, pivoting a little bit, but tanks still have a very important role to play, and it's going to be interesting to see how tanks would be utilized by, say, the UK and the US in war. But as for Russia and Ukraine, when I was with the tank unit near around the battle for Toretsk, so they told me that they function much more like mobile artillery. So they drive out from their dugout, they shoot, and then they quickly go back for cover. They don't engage in tank on tank battles. And FPV drones are one of the biggest threats to them. So if they drive out, they get out from cover, a $500 FPV drone, and it hits them in the right placement, followed up by another 1 or 2 FPV drones, can neutralize that tank. And so tanks have definitely changed drastically in how they're being used in war. But I think it's important also to not over-index on some of the lessons from this war of, yes, like Ukrainian and Russian tanks are not having the impact that one would have thought they would have in this war. But that's because we don't see really anyone having air superiority to provide support to these things. And I think if the US and the UK was engaged in war with the amount of resources and technology but the ability to potentially establish air superiority would change how tanks would perform in war. And so there are very important lessons to take away from this war, but not every lesson would be one for the West to take away, because how the West would fight in a war would be very different when the Ukraine is having to be very scrappy, fighting with very little resources and fighting with so many restrictions.
Just on the lessons, I know you've written recently about the military lessons for NATO from the Russia-Ukraine war. Can you run us through some of your key points?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, one of the most important lessons would definitely be drones. Drones, in the sense that Ukraine has used them on land and in the sea. So Ukraine has successfully used marine drones to neutralize Russia's Black Sea fleet, and really defanged Russia's navy in the Black Sea. And I mean, again, drones aren't new per se. I mean, I think we saw what was in the year 2000, the Houthis used an unmanned craft to hit an American ship. So we have seen the uses of drones, and certainly America was using them in the Middle East. But now what you have is anybody can take any volunteer can take a drone and buy it off Amazon or go to the store and buy it. So you can buy a Chinese DJI Mavic 3 drone, which is both used for reconnaissance and even at times dropping explosives. So anybody can go and buy that drone and give it to the Ukrainian army, and it will be used on the battlefield. And so I think we're seeing war decentralizing a bit in terms of the average individual can begin to play a much more important role. And so Ukraine's story has been that of the common person, where volunteers are building entire supply chains for military units, where for a good period of the war, they were entirely dependent on these volunteers to bring them drones. And then we also see, even on the cyberspace, Ukraine had built a volunteer hacker army to wage cyber offensives against the Russians, of which at one point the Ukrainian DDoS attacks were DDoSing CCTV cameras in Russia while Ukrainian drones were flying by, so that they would knock out their visibility, and so the Ukrainian drones would be able to hit their targets. And I mean, there's just individuals all around the world conducting these DDoS attacks. We also saw the battlefield extending into many different domains. So the Russians conducting arson attacks in the UK, in other European countries, conducting cyber attacks against water treatment facilities in Europe, in the US. And so the Russians believe that the battlefield is no longer confined to Ukraine. It extends to many different domains. And every dollar that's spent on protecting critical infrastructure or any diversion or any shifting of resources away from Ukraine are resources that will never help Ukraine or reach the Ukrainian battlefield. And so the Russians feel that they need to take war and bring it onto all these different domains, and inflict as much pain as they can on the West through hybrid warfare. But as we mentioned earlier, transitioning to practical military lessons, that raw firepower hasn't changed, industrial capacity has not changed. So the need to scale, to be able to manufacture shells, to produce weapons. I mean, the Russians, if the war was to pause and the Russians were to get a ceasefire, they would be able to scale at such a fast rate to replenish all of their losses and to prepare for a much bigger war. And if Ukraine was to fall, all of Ukraine's very impressive military industrial complex would go, and the Russians would take it, and it would go to support the Russian war machine. We already see Ukrainians in the occupied territories being conscripted into the Russian army. And so if Ukraine falls, all of Ukraine, its industrial output would be absorbed into Russia's. And if you look at Germany, they made the big news that they would reinvest into their military and rebuild, invest about $100 billion or euros into the army. But now one of the latest reports that I read within the last few weeks is that it would take Germany either 100 or 200 years to get back to their 2004 levels. And so much of Western Europe is sleepwalking into a potential very large scale European war against the Russians. And so again, yes, the Russians have made many mistakes. They've been learning. They've been getting better. And if the war was to pause, then sure, maybe it wouldn't be 1 to 2 years. It would be a few more years. But the Russians are in a wartime footing, in a wartime economy, and they would be able to rebuild and potentially wage that very large scale war that Europe really isn't preparing for. But it also shows that a country like Ukraine using asymmetrical warfare, so building out and scaling its domestic weapons and drone industry, can have devastating effects on a much larger power like Russia. And so, yeah, traditional lessons, key traditional lessons have not changed. So the raw firepower, the industrial output, but other aspects such as drone warfare, and just how quickly warfare is evolving. I think even myself going back to the front multiple times, and each time I go back and see how fast warfare is evolving, all the new technologies that are being adopted, it really blows my mind. And I think that the final point that I would make is around AI and warfare. So we see the Ukrainians and the Russians using it in numerous aspects. And so Ukraine has been using Palantir software to help with its targeting of both for artillery firing, drone targeting. But we also see that there's always going to be countermeasures developed to the countermeasures. So when drones became common across the battlefield and the Ukrainians were using them very well, the Russians were very powerful at using electronic warfare and jamming these drones. And so the next front is going to be who can develop drones that are resistant to electronic warfare, and that can fly to their target. And so even if they were to lose connection, say in that final mile or final kilometer of delivery, and the connection is lost, that drone can take over at least the autonomous system and drive and fly directly into that target and hit them. And so I think even Anduril, one of the rising stars of the U.S. Private sector, they've been testing some of one of their Bolt drones, autonomous drones, and so they've been testing it in Ukraine, like other weapon companies. But really, Ukraine is at the center of training these AI drones. They have all the battlefield data. they're training these algorithms, teaching them how does a Russian tank move, what does a Russian soldier look like. And to me, really, my big concern after talking with Ukrainian soldiers are, we've seen that Russia doesn't abide by international law. Ethics doesn't mean anything to the Russians. So what happens if we develop fully autonomous systems and they're flying out there and the Russians start getting, they suffering devastating casualties, but then they decide, why don't we just dress up like civilians and walk around the front line dressed like civilians? Will the Ukrainians actually uh, develop the AI to hit these civilians? And even recently, I was talking with some of the Ukrainian units, and what they've been taking losses from Russian special forces dressed in Ukrainian uniform, coming behind their lines and hitting their positions. And so the Russians will do anything and everything that they can to try to gain a battlefield advantage. And so what the right answer is, and how to develop these autonomous systems, or I mean, even if you develop in the right way, what happens if you're able to connect a cyber attack and take over one of these autonomous systems and turn it back against the operator? But I think what we see is just wars evolving very fast, very rapidly. There's the introduction of new technologies is happening every day, and wars changing faster than we've ever seen before.
David, this has been genuinely fascinating. Really appreciate your insights and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.